Now, we've talked about change in the past, but it's also important to know where we fit in change as well ourselves. Now, talking about the Civil War and emancipation on their 150th anniversaries is talking about ourselves as well as our past. We're not going to change things that happened in 1861. But 2011, maybe this could be a vehicle for the things that a lot of us care about so much can actually help us today. Is the U.S. finally ready to talk about this subject in a new way? A poll from the Pew Foundation finds that more than half Americans still think the Civil War was fought over states' rights. And the younger the people they polled, the more they thought that. I look surprised because no historian has argued that in a very long time. Our textbooks don't say this. But this is still what most Americans would think. On the other hand, we have glory, which has shown people something we neglected to tell them. The 200,000 black men fought and died, and in many ways helped save the Union. I hope our students and people remember that movie, which now has been 20 years ago. We're making a movie right now in Richmond about the last days of Abraham Lincoln. Daniel Day-Lewis, Sally Field, and so that moment when Abraham Lincoln, between the end of the war, the burning of Richmond, and his assassination, comes to Richmond, surrounded by the freed people. So we've known that all the controversies surrounding fourth grade textbooks in Virginia that get their information off the internet about how many black Confederates there were, joyful reenactments of Jefferson Davis's inauguration in Montgomery, and so forth. So you can have on one hand people really feeling with Denzel Washington and glory, on the other hand somehow not connecting that with what the war might have been about. Now, all of us are going to be interpreting this war somewhere. Now, as a historian of the region, it was interesting to hear everybody understands themselves in region, describes yourselves in relation to other places. So we're all somewhere. So we're all going to have to do our own work of thinking about what particular thing do they need to hear in Kentucky, which became a Confederate state after the war was over. Or kind of like West Virginia. You see more Confederate flags in West Virginia than you do in Virginia. I feel like I never do actually. Say, what are you thinking? But also, what are you supposed to think about when Florida? Is that really the South? Or what if you're in Civil War Central in Fredericksburg, or even more central, maybe Richmond, where I live? And so I thought about this a little bit and went back and I thought, okay, if we're going to do these things, and we had the first event in the nation at the University of Richmond on the sesquicentennial, 2009, over 2,000 people showed up to talk about America on the eve of the Civil War from 26 states. I thought, okay, if I'm going to do this, what do we see? Well, 50 years ago, as you know, Richmond is sort of the shrine of the lost cause and Monument Avenue and all those kinds of things. They built a $1.75 million building for the centennial, shaped like a flying saucer, with the modern technology. They had Princess phones inside where you could listen to recordings and see electric lights tracing all these things. And something that every Civil War museum needs, a Mercury space capsule outside in 1960, because that's really what this was all about. This was about America, whatever those little differences we had in the past, now standing strong against communism and winning the space race. And matter of fact, the Centennial Commission did not mention African Americans anywhere, did not even talk about them anywhere. The NAACP argued about this. The NAACP said, no attempt to glorify the Confederacy can be valid, for it was founded upon slavery, the most immoral of all human relations. So it's not that people didn't know it or couldn't say it, but no white person in authority in 1960-61 paid attention. Now, as all of us know, during the centennial, a great moral revolution in American history took place. In an eerie echo, the civil rights struggle taking place exactly the same time as the centennial. So the anniversaries of Manassas and Gettysburg and Atlanta coinciding with events in Washington and Selma and Birmingham in ways that few could miss. And so the centennial, which starts out in Virginia with people talking about states' rights and crossing their arms and we're proud of all of this, by 1965 only 5,000 people show up at Appomattox after the 35,000 that had been at Manassas. And the centennial kind of limps to a close. And people wondered, does it have anything to say to us now after the Civil Rights Revolution? It seemed irrelevant to many people. Now, the South has changed in remarkable ways since 1961. My own state of Virginia is now the 9th wealthiest state in the country. Helped elect President Obama in 2008. Most people in Richmond and in Virginia were not born there, and there's 60 languages spoken in the schools of Richmond. And reflecting these, Virginia has created a sesquicentennial commission in 2006. Here's what they said. It's important to know this is not a celebration. There is no joy to be found in a war that caused the deaths of over 620,000 Americans, divided families, tore apart a nation, and left cities in ruin. Rather, it is a commemoration. It is a solemn remembrance of the Americans, men, women, and children, black and white, from the North and the South, who lived, fought, and died for that which they believed. So it turns out that, could we do anything with that? What would happen when 2011 rolled around? Are we really ready to tell the story in a new way? And at that convention that we had in our basketball arena at the University of Richmond, home of the Spiders, a great moment, Charles Dew, an excellent historian from Williams College, had 3 huge screens. And we were debating. My premise then is time always matters, so we could not talk about anything that happened after December 31st, 1859. I told people who were there, Robert E. Lee is going to end this year still in the United States Army, so if you're hoping for some shooting, it's not going to happen. But people stayed anyway. And what they saw on that day on those 3 screens were a single page from the account books of one slave trading company in Richmond. And it showed in 1859, Hector Davis did $2.3 million worth of business in 1859 dollars. And people just gasped. And we've taken it out of the context of what caused the Civil War, whatever. It's just like, here's a fact. This is one of the biggest businesses in the city and one of the biggest businesses in Virginia. And Virginia is the largest slave state. And slavery is not just gang laborers in cotton fields, but it's people working, building locomotives and producing flour and working in tourism. As you saw in the reading from Fredericksburg, slavery is remarkably complex. We imagine slavery being simple because it had coercion at its heart. But I'm not sure there's any human relationships more complicated than slavery, of people living together in the domestic environments. And you can see that in Jubilee by Margaret Walker in this, the kind of the ties. What do we think about all that? So it turned out that we kind of misunderstood slavery. That it turns out that slavery was not growing weaker, that it would not have faded away. It had never been stronger than in 1860. It could have adapted to the modern world. People began to think about this in a new way, and people would come and say, Ed, I just never thought about that. Because we took it out of the usual boxes and talked about it. Here, just think about this. And one of the things that I found myself doing in my city is that people invited me to give talks of the title in my own head is, why the heck should I care about your Civil War? Islamic Cultural Center had me come in and talk about this. The Virginia Asian Chamber of Commerce had me come in and talk about this. That's a good question. If you just sort of say, well, it's my inheritance or whatever, you can, or there's this battlefield here. But why should I care if my ancestors came here 12 years ago or 3 years ago? What's the point? What is there worth knowing about this? And we've made it easy not to care about the Civil War. A lot of it's tacky. A lot of it's trivial. The chess sets and the license plates and all those kinds of things. But it turns out that people are curious about why would it matter? So when I went to those gatherings and tried to pull the camera back a little bit and say, well, in world history, let's forget that it happened in our backyard. Let's forget that somebody's great-great-granddaddy fought with somebody somewhere, and that there's that statue you see every day in the town square in front of the public library, maybe. Let's forget all that and think about this maybe happening somewhere else. What was it really about? Well, what you had, let's forget what caused it. Let's just talk about if it had turned out the way that the advocates of secession in that reading we're talking about tomorrow wanted to happen. What if the Confederacy had won its independence? Whether there was a war or not. You would have had the 4th richest economy in the world based on perpetual bondage as its own nation state, controlling the major monopoly of the major commodity in the world. There would have been a model of building an industrial state with the largest number of railroads and telegraphs, the highest in the world on enslaved labor. And the South would have been free to think Now we need to bring in the sister territories that should rightfully be a part of Cuba, Mexico, Central America. We figured it out. We figured out how do you blend Christianity and industrialization with this terrible burden of enslavement that is our responsibility. We figured it out. So we can create an ever larger sphere of all that. What would world history have looked like? Not only if the United States had broken apart, as Abraham Lincoln feared, to show that a large democracy could not survive, but what instead you had a nation state that was so powerful on its own with no check against its ambitions. And what would have happened too if African Americans had not been able to help make themselves free by rushing to the United States Army within weeks of the beginning of the war, before Manassas, before the first battle. There are already black people going to the Union fort in Fort Monroe and saying, we're on your side, risking their lives to do that. Emancipation begins as soon as the war begins. It's not just a product of the war. It's not just something that white people give to black people. It's something that black people seize for themselves. And what do we see there? That the Civil War was not a passing event, but is at the heart of what this nation's about. Freedom and respect and possibility for all Americans. Until you had emancipation, this country couldn't even really begin its true history. The beginning of the United States we live in today began with emancipation and with the 14th Amendment that says if you're born in this country, you're American. If you live in this country, you have due process of law. People in the Islamic Cultural Center and the Asian Chamber of Commerce go, well, that makes sense to me. That what makes sense to me is that the freedom of all Americans is based on the freedom that came out of this Civil War. And to the extent that we neglect the full history and humanity of any peoples, we diminish the full history and humanity of all peoples. So this is more than just an interesting thing to talk about. I really do believe that this is the mainspring of what this country is really about and what it can be. And so to have the opportunity to talk about this with people in a way that our culture doesn't provide otherwise. How do you have a sort of a conversation about these hard things once you get out of a classroom? You don't. You only do it if you have the ALA and the NEH having the vision to bring something like this together. So I look forward to working with everybody on this. I'm so proud to be associated with all of you. And I look forward to learning from you tomorrow. We'll be talking about that first thing, and I hope that they'll, I didn't mess us up. I'll end where I began. Now that the adrenaline's wearing off, I find that I'm still anxious that we live up to this remarkable opportunity. Thanks very much.